Hello, everyone. Welcome.
We're live.
What do you think of the keynotes? Woo? Good stuff? So I'm excited to have this conversation today. What we really want to share with you today is the perspective of three different types of companies who are trying to solve for the same problem: developing software securely, fast-paced, innovate quickly without taking on unnecessary risk. With me today, we have Sidhu, who's a senior engineer at Box. Box similar company to GitHub in terms of the challenges related to regulatory requirements. So they're obviously servicing customers in this space, and they have to go through a lot of the same challenges to become compliant based on their customers' needs as well. We have Natalie Bradley, who's a senior manager at Accenture Federal Services, and she's going to bring the perspective of her customers and how they're going through this journey and what she sees. And last but not least is Thomas Curran, who's the CIO of Deutsche Börse Group. Hopefully I said that correctly. Otherwise known as the German Stock Exchange. And he can talk about the experience that they're going through right now with their modernization journey. Myself, I'm Mike Filosa. I am a solution engineer on the East Coast with GitHub. Been with GitHub for about 3 years. And I work with a lot of the financial services customers in New York and New England as well. So I'll offer some thoughts as we go through as well. So first we have a question to get us going. And I'll ask Sid to kick us off here. Where is Box on their journey in DevOps and modernization, and how is the compliance world impacting that? Oh, is that on?
Can you hear me?
Are we live there?
Are we live? Yeah, we are. Awesome. So like you mentioned, where we come in is we are servicing customers in the healthcare industry, in the financial services, and some of the same challenges as GitHub has. So that's where you are talking about compliance issues, not just for a specific vertical, for example, financial or healthcare, but we have to make sure we are compliant and secure as pertains to all of the customers we are servicing. And we are a modern, innovative cloud provider, so it's an interesting balance of you want to make sure you can move the code through the pipeline fast. You want to make sure your engineers can iterate quickly, and you want to make sure you do not hinder the speed of innovation, at the same time staying compliant and secure. So in terms of the question you asked about where we are in that journey, I think in terms of our software development practices, I would say we are pretty far advanced, especially for a company our size. Now there's always room for improvement. So as we explore our conversation further today, I guess we'll have some examples to share on that.
Sure, thank you. And Natalie, if you could add, what you're seeing with the customers that you service, particularly in the federal government, and what they're going through. I think there's a lot of modernization underway there.
Yeah, there's the organizations that I support are very, very siloed. Everybody does things their own way because of governance, regulations, security, very specifically. And we're finding that getting collaboration to be an acceptable term is a challenge. There's a huge cultural change that we're pushing. We have set up a enterprise-level DevOps platform in a couple of our client spaces, and the uptake of that has been significant, but it's not without a lot of work with our security folks, the senior leadership teams, anyone that will basically listen to us about how cool it is and why it's better and why it's safer and more cost-effective. It's been a challenge, but we're 3 years in, and the success we've had has been pretty significant, which we will talk about here shortly.
Anything to add, Sid?
Yeah, so Deutsche Börse Group is also not only an exchange, it also has a lot of what I would call what are called in the industry post-trade activities that include clearing, settlement, custody of financial instruments. And what's important is similar to, I guess, the federal services, the organization over time developed a very siloed and sort of islands of software and product development. And so what we decided to do in July of 2016 I just imagine just sort of pressing a red button and just getting a complete developer infrastructure of about 2,500 people onto GitHub within 3 months. And I think that it's very important that organizations, when you do it, if you call it a journey or whatever, transformation, is that it really has to be driven more or less by the developers themselves. Although in our case, we went to the CEO, got a memo, got a date, and people listened. But in the end, the doing part is really important, and I think the normal propensity to not do things in these organizations is very high because it's walled off and it's hard to get transparency. But now we can get at least transparency on everything that Deutsche Börse Group does in terms of software today is in GitHub.
Yeah, just a brief observation. I've seen when I talk to customers that deploy GitHub, oftentimes regulatory compliance or security becomes sort of a safety objection that some of these organizations will use. Well, we can't do that. We don't work that way. We have to follow this process that we've had for 5, 10, 15 years. Have you experienced any of that in your organization, trying to modernize that and push them a little bit in that direction? Is that something that you've had to deal with?
Yeah, I think that's a very common roadblock, I would say, for a lot of organizations. I think we probably all see that. But again, the arguments we could make were, one, having it fully transparent, one single source of truth in terms of software and source code is ultimately better for security. We have a better manageability. We have transparency. We can see everything everyone does, more or less. And it gives us more automation potential. Again, all of those things do something that's extremely valuable in regulated industries, which is automates a lot of stuff, takes people out of the equation. And people, by the way, are probably the biggest single security problem anyway.
Sure, Natalie, I'm sure you have something to add here in modernization. Are there any sort of techniques you've used or tools or processes that you've tried to instill in your customers?
We have there's a heavy belief that if it's not broke, don't fix it. We've done a really great job of showing them how it's broken, right? You have a software developer that spends 20% of their time doing software development and 80% doing administrative work. Bringing in tools like GitHub where they can start with an actual product baseline or lines of code to share and replicate has significantly improved what we're doing, but finding disks and USBs and servers underneath people's desks with bits and pieces and parts of software and binaries and dependencies. If they were actual tangible objects, hiding in people's closets, it was a mess. And so for us to be able to show an organization that putting that together, automating those processes and being able to collaborate is far more secure, but it also speeds up things and it gets our developers to actually do what they enjoy. And that's improved those organizations significantly in modern technology.
I just want to add 2 things to that. So it's interesting when you mentioned that, when we talk about how things have been done historically or when the compliance requirements are put forth or that's the reason not to do something. It's also, I think, important to dig deeper and see, are you using those compliance requirements as implementation details where they're like, okay, this is how you need to implement who approves code, just as an example, versus what is the actual compliance requirement that you're trying to solve for? Because if the conversation ends up being about what the requirement is, then you can be creative and work with your compliance teams about actually coming up with solutions that work with both your engineering culture, how things are done, and at the same time, you do want to meet those compliance requirements. So I think that definitely helps if you're able to go away from this is how we've done and this is how you want to implement it, to this is really the compliance control we want to take care of. Are there any other ways we can satisfy it? And the other thing I want to add there was, it's so for us, we've been on Git and we've been using GitHub Enterprise, but when you have new requirements come in for compliance, you also want to make sure that they don't hinder the speed of innovation. So it's interesting, for a group like mine, where we are sort of an in-between person between your compliance team and your engineers. So it's a challenge where you do want to implement those controls. They are important for business. At the same time, you want to make sure it's not slowing engineers down, it's not reducing their productivity. So coming up with creative tools, auditing, for example, maybe you can leverage GitHub's
Audit log.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yep.
You can use those things. And there are other creative ways. For example, you need to have some further metadata around commits and anything you can automate. That way, it's not a productivity impediment for your engineer. At the same time, you're solving for those compliance things. And I think looking creatively at those things definitely helps.
Yeah, from my perspective, a lot of the challenges can be aided by workflow and by automation of the workflow. To Thomas's point, features in GitHub that can allow this to happen, other products that come into play, really can enable sort of that peace of mind that security teams need in order to understand that the risk is being controlled, that there's an audit trail for what's happening, there's an approval process for changes to get into production. That to me is the biggest sort of point that needs to get made to these organizations. Are there specific regulatory policies that you're struggling? Is it HIPAA? Is it PCI? What are the specific regulatory requirements that you're currently struggling with?
I think all or most of them.
Natalie, what are you seeing with your customers? Any specific?
I think first of all, any finance is a highly regulated industry, but it's still not as regulated as telecom or healthcare. I think there's in every one of these industries some very specific framework for regulation. One thing to keep in mind, which is unique though I think for many people here, is that the software development process itself is also, you could say, semi-regulated. So you have to have a lot of transparency about how product development works, and in particular, it has to be auditable. Someone comes from a regulator and wants to see certain things that happen. So I would recommend very early on to think about how to get a Git flow-like process in place and show it to auditors and show them the tools. And by the way, get GitHub involved in the discussion and get auditors the right type of tool chest. Keep in mind that these companies in general or these agencies are not exactly modern software developers. So you have to really hold hands with them, but also make sure that you do the right thing for your company. And my sense and my experience has been, I'm not from the finance industry really, but my experience has been very much, if you show it and it makes sense and you can document it and it's easy for them to understand, they'll really work with you on it.
Our struggle is a lot with security. We have ICD 503 compliance regulations, and to build an awesome product in weeks or months, it will take 9 months to a year to get it accredited and usable on a production system. And that's what we're struggling with the most, is to get security and the senior leadership team to recognize that the products that come out of like a DevOps pipeline are quality, and there's visibility and there's consistency, resiliency in the products. Teams are doing things earlier and more often, and they're more secure. But it's that hurdle of, well, all of these boxes have to be checked, and all of this paperwork that no one really looks at has to be completed. How do we streamline that, and how do we get their acceptance to change such a incredible policy?
Sure. So let me shift gears a little bit and talk about how cloud affects this. I know Box probably has a pretty good perspective on this. What are you seeing? I mean, obviously your customers believe in adopting the cloud, right, with respect to their future. How does that have an impact on their regulatory requirements? I mean, they must put pretty demanding requirements on you.
It is demanding, and I think it goes through your whole stack. From my perspective, how does that affect our code pipeline, for example? How are we deploying and shipping code, and do we have the right controls in place? Are we making it easy to do the right thing, not just by developers, which is, can they add test more easily? What is that process like? But also, maybe for our compliance and security teams, how easily auditable something is. I think from the customer's perspective, it's I'm not fully qualified to answer this, but at the same time, if you look at over the past couple of years, some of the things that have happened in security, so then you have to talk about your product and how secure it is in that cloud environment. And then you have features like we have EKM, Enterprise Key Management, where you get to store the key that decrypts the data. So then you have to come up with these other creative ways or value adds on your product that the customers can use to essentially have more confidence in what they're doing with their product.
Yeah, Natalie, would you add a little bit about what you're seeing in the federal space with cloud and cloud strategy and how that impacts this?
So the environment that I work in, we have a private cloud air-gapped from the network, so nobody can Google really cool things. But our developers think that that means it's more safe and secure. Our senior leadership thinks the complete opposite, that it's a cloud and you send data up in a balloon and it lives there. So we're changing. It's another kind of a learning curve and a maturity adoption that we're having. It's teams to recognize the security of it. Due to the sensitivity of a lot of the data that we store, only certain projects are allowed in the cloud, and that is through a rigorous, incredible security process to determine that they're secure, their boundaries are all tied off, all those great things. So it's a journey that we're kind of in the middle of. We have majority of all of our projects moved to our private cloud, but there's still so many that have yet to be accepted to move. But I think it's really just a learning and a maturity more so than the difficulty of the platform itself.
I think cloud is extremely important for developing software today. I mean, in our case, we use 4 different cloud platforms. So we use Google Cloud Platform, we use SAP, we use Microsoft, Azure, and AWS. Primarily, we use AWS, I would say, as the bulk of developers. There was a tremendous amount of concern at all the top management about moving product development to the cloud. It began with one simple thing, which is speed. We're way too slow in a sort of lockdown, islands of siloed software development. And the cloud gives us a lot more transparency and a lot of speed. But again, moving things to the cloud, you're going to have, we moved GitHub very early to the cloud as well. So we moved our GitHub Enterprise onto AWS. AWS in particular, none of the 4 cloud platforms are qualified for production grade software today in the finance industry. So that means, in our case, in Europe, we have to get and go with AWS to the regulators and implement a number of things. Most of it is around data, sort of data location, data privacy, encryption, hardware encryption keys, who holds the keys. So there are a lot of things for developers that are more complicated, including also augmenting the security models of cloud providers. A lot of simple stuff doesn't work when you do that. If you're looking to, Travis or Circle or Jenkins, you have different key structures and different authentication sort of structures. So when you try to automate things, sometimes that breaks down. You have to be a little bit aware of those things very early on. But across the board, I think it's given our organization a lot more, first of all, it's given the security teams a lot more responsibility to think and work like developers, so they have to come up with solutions that developers can use. As an example, you need, if you want to implement a security model on top of IAM and AWS, then it has to be API'd. You have to be able to get the tokens in and out of it very easily. If you can't do that, then you have big, the developers sort of revolt. But again, GitHub gives us a lot more transparency and code reusability across all of the different products that helps us tremendously. So cloud, I think, again, you look at different deployment options in the cloud. Some of that will be helpful to look at different tools also besides GitHub, maybe stuff like Terraform that help you go across the different clouds. But definitely, I would say if you ask people today, after a year of working on AWS, I think we trained 600 developers already in it. I think no one would want to go back to whatever the way it was. The other thing to keep in mind in the cloud is you have to really purpose your developers, and that's also in regulated industries awkward. I mean, you want your developers to have actually really powerful machines so they can do stuff themselves and they can use the cloud for the right stuff. That's important, and you want to implement in GitHub models that accommodate for that. For instance, we look a lot at like PR velocity and don't keep a lot of code open and off the cloud. So a lot of those things are just also getting people, into new models of thinking and working. If they use PVCS or clear case or something like that, they would have checked out code and kept it for a month themselves, and no one would know what's going on. So cloud helps you, but you have to also have the workflow for that.
I think I wanted to highlight something you said. So for us, what has been helpful is leaning on the security teams. Where, okay, this is where the world is going. We're bought into it. We think this is the way to go. Now you help us be secure in that world. And that conversation helps drive some of the controls you're implementing and what else you bring there. So for us, definitely leaning on them and working closely with them has helped accelerate the speed at which we can adopt some of the new technologies.
Yeah, and I think back to workflow and automation. I mean, these cloud solutions, many of them have very good automation, workflow, and API accessibility. So when you're talking about automating a lot of the sort of tasks you need to do to track change in software, you can do that all the way through the pipeline very nicely with the cloud strategy today, right? So I've seen a lot of the financial companies and healthcare companies that have adopted GitHub Enterprise have a portion of their workload begin to move into the cloud, and more of that, especially in those companies that have, I think, succeeded. But I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about talent. I know as a developer, from my experience, if I work at a company and it's frustrating to build software because I have to jump through 15, 16 steps to get my product in the eyes of people, in the hands of people, I think engineers are hard to attract if you don't create an environment that allows them to succeed, right? And I think it does relate to this discussion because I think the companies that are doing well in this space are tackling this challenge and doing a good job of allowing those developers to have a certain amount of freedom. Any thoughts on any challenges related to the companies you've seen be successful or your companies and how talent has played into that?
I think it's very closely related when we talk about if I'm leading productivity engineering and we are essentially building tools that are used by developers, I think that has a direct impact on how fast they can innovate, how fast they can iterate. And if we have impediments in that workflow, that's very demoralizing. And if you're competing with another company that is far ahead of you on that curve, you will be, it won't be good for you when you're out looking for talent. So definitely optimizing for the developer's time, optimizing for them spending time on the right thing versus spending time on things that can be automated away. So you have to pick your battles with compliance. At the same time, any place where you can automate and deliver on what the requirements are and not have them jump through the hoops. I think you have to make it easy to do the right thing by them, the right thing by the business, and it's a balance to strike.
In an environment where security clearances are required, so hiring talent that already comes with these skill sets is really difficult. So we spend a lot of time on kind of maturing our developers, but what we found, GitHub, great example, is they are using it in their real lives. Grad students, college students all know GitHub, so we're looking more at providing the tools that the developers want to see, not what someone in a high-level position was told this is what you need to use. And we found that the adoption and the usability and the great places to work are because the developers are excited about those tools. We actually had a guy in one of our organizations. He's a developer who had been working straight out of college in an agency for 8 months, and he was just about to leave because he thought that it was so stagnant and so hard to get anything done. And when he heard that we had GitHub, he is like, I feel like I'm in college again and I'm using really cool things. And he started recruiting friends. We're like, this is so exciting, all because we have a tool that the outside world actually has. So it's worked out well.
Yeah, I think I can add a little bit of just sense of, first of all, GitHub was a reaction to some extent on not having the talent. In other words, implementing GitHub was the first step in making the workplace more attractive. We had a lot of problems hiring new people. And we couldn't hire these people because it was a horrible place to work. I mean, you didn't have any visibility, what other teams were doing. You couldn't share stuff with others. You couldn't find anyone if you were looking on Java or Python or stuff like that. You had a lot of trouble that the built-in organization didn't realize it was sort of out of date and out of sync with how the rest of the world works. So that's one thing that GitHub helps solve. Second thing is when you're running to recruit new teams. Of course, they want to use modern tools. We have now, I would say, a really strong group of passionate GitHub users that we can also dispatch to talk to other developers, and they find each other. Also, we also use public.github.com for some of our stuff to help just interface with customers. Actually, we use GitHub as the sole way of interacting with Amazon, with Microsoft, Google, SAP, a lot of other companies that we just use GitHub repositories to do it. That's the other part of GitHub that we should also mention in our industry. We want to use GitHub also to include a lot of the, let's call them non-developers in the organization and get them working on everything from agreements to a lot of people that are doing things, you could think it's almost development, but it turns out they're very walled gardens like Cloudera and other types of data science products. And you have these data scientists that are, super smart people, but they don't understand software development. And then getting GitHub actually in use, in play, it's a challenge for the company, I think, to go out and actually create more integration with these type of tools so we can onboard them into the software community as opposed to having these, isolated worlds. The cloud also helps with that, but again, I think having more talent that is aware of GitHub in the beginning helps get those teams, I think, in the bigger sort of GitHub community in our case.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, touch on something you said there related to open and transparency. You kind of alluded to with finding resources, finding repositories. That can sound very scary to someone who doesn't understand what that is when it comes to regulatory compliance, right? What does that mean? Everything's out there to be seen. What if we have confidential information inside this repository? What if we're dealing with, trade secrets or things that we can't expose to anybody else? In one of the challenges I have, and maybe you've run into this when you've talked to folks inside your organizations around GitHub, is it's not always everything's transparent, right? You have the concept of an organization, right? You can scope the content to the different audiences, and you can make exceptions for certain types of code. So have you had to have those conversations internally? Maybe Thomas, you may be a good person to go to first.
Yeah, I mean, we sat down at the very, start from GitHub. Probably, I put together, 10, 15 people that volunteer because they like GitHub to just think about how to implement it. So we do some unusual things if you look at it from a developer standpoint. We have a dev repository, which is all-inclusive, all organization, and everything's in there. But then when you want to release something, it goes into a release repository, and that's more or less, that's solely for documentation and for regulatory reasons. So we have, a isolated area where we can just release stuff from, and that's very important, I guess, in setting it up. It's also important to think about different policies. There's a lot of stuff that's regulated, or at least compliance around how to release new features. So there has to be a sort of 4 or 6I concept that you have to implement and have code reviews and reviewers and sort of committers aware of that. In our case, that was a transition for a lot of the teams. So I think there are a lot of things like that you can build in pretty quickly and learn from, but it's important to give it some thought. I mean, a lot of things we see, for instance, when you move from like teams that are using Subversion, they have all kinds of repositories, and getting them to really get into a feature-driven development is difficult. But you have to help them by engineering some of their repositories differently, and maybe even starting with really a mono-repository concept. So transferring people from other systems and actually creating a world that gives them more, let's call it, comfort when we're talking about regulation is extremely important and shared across the team. We also use Slack. We have a very vibrant GitHub channel in Slack, so developers can also trade notes. It's very technical, but I think we have a lot of people in it that aren't also doing product management or business analysis, and they add and contribute to stuff as well.
We've taken a two-part approach. One is live demos to security, mostly, of showing them, this is a private repo, this is a public repo, and this is what you can see, and this is what you can't see, and this is what it means to have an organization. And we use LDAP for everything, so and PKI, so authentication and authorization. And then the second part of what we've done is working with the developers to help them understand the difference between source code and data, and to keep your data out of your source code and not have your passwords unmasked in the clear, and have PII data. So that's helped us a lot with people to understand why it's a secure environment, why it's easy to use, the benefits of it, but it really is kind of a show and tell, and also a learning curve for acceptable source code practices.
Our journey's been a little opposite to what you've seen, because you're starting from a scrappy startup, and you have a very open and transparent engineering culture. Everybody can see all pieces of code.
A lot like our journey, I think.
Right. And as we grew as a company, you have more and more compliance and security requirements coming in. So how do you maintain that culture and still, bring in these compliance requirements? So for us, what has helped is, for example, with GitHub Enterprise, being able to even say, okay, this piece of code is critical, and this piece of code requires this set of people to review it, and bringing in requirements or having controls like that has helped us still keep things as transparent as people want it to be. At the same time, have those checks in place in the pipeline, so you satisfy compliance requirements.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit on GitHub's journey there. So we were very, very open as an organization. We still are quite open, but we are now going through a lot of the same things you've gone through. And for example, having to request access for certain repositories was something that when I started at GitHub, you just were able to just access them. Right now, you got to go. So there's a process in place, and there's audit trails and checks and balances, which is a good thing, right, for a company maturing. But it's very different than Thomas's experience. Probably quite a bit different, right? You want to add anything to that?
We had a lot of, you'd be surprised, I guess, or maybe not, but even like the senior executive board, was extremely paranoid about having all the source code in one place. And there was really a lot of negativity around, well, someone's going to steal our entire source code repository, and this is, was super, they were super hyped up about that. And I remember going to like a board meeting with a USB stick and just, this is our complete source code, and it was everything, MVS, ZOS, VMS, and all the Linux stuff. But you get, I think, a lot of irrational thoughts around what's secret, what's important to keep secret, and what's really super valuable. And you need a process to go through that. I have to say, philosophically, I'm from day one said, look, we have to keep everything open. We do have a little secret sauce repository somewhere, but more or less, if you wanted to rebuild Deutsche Börse today, and you had the wherewithal to go through all the COBOL and Java code, you could do it, with our GitHub repository. So.
So we have about 5 minutes left. What I'd like to do is ask if you could offer something maybe on a positive note, maybe an experience with a customer that made a transformation, a small win, a big win, and leave the room here with some inspiration for knowing that they can actually solve these problems.
So I think a lot of times, everyone here probably can imagine doing all their stuff in GitHub, but you have a lot of decision makers in companies, especially these regulated industries. No one on the board of Deutsche Börse has a computer background, right? So getting people to understand what you're talking about is extremely important. And I remember signing up my boss onto GitHub. It was a Friday afternoon. I tried to explain to him, this is really cool. You can watch everything. You can see what's going on. You can see if something's working and who's doing what. And he just didn't get it because he didn't develop software. So I signed him up to github.com, got him, and I said, look, just so you can get a feel of how it works, why don't we watch a project? And I went to Docker and signed him up to watch Docker. And literally, when he got off the plane, he was like, his wife picked him up and said someone hacked our email account because they had all these, information activity from Docker, very vibrant stuff. So, but I said to him, yeah, okay, we'll turn it off, but isn't that the type of things you want to get? You want a lot of information about what's going on, and GitHub helps you get that. So I think it's one of the things that's great about the product is collaboration, but it's also a way for non-technical people to get more visibility, and I think the better you can communicate that with examples, do stuff with your management on GitHub. Just get them in, our CEO gave a whole speech on GitHub the other day. And I think that really makes it work for the company.
We a huge success for us coming from completely siloed, need to know only, people don't like to talk to each other. We have thousands of repos in GitHub right now, and over 50% of them are public. Our users know what that means. The pull requests are incredibly high. I think that's a huge change for us in our organization. It's very exciting, and as all of you taxpayers, this is very rewarding.
I think it's important to share the wins and the positive things that come from it. For me, as a manager, when I'm out, looking for talent, when I can point somebody, a prospective, employee to our open source repo, and they can look at the code, which is a great win because you can actually see what you'll be doing when you join the team. So I think there's the talent piece of it. And the other big thing I've learned over the past couple of years is the better or the closer I work with our compliance and security teams, those experts, and think of them as partners to collaborate with and making our pipeline more secure, more compliant, the easier that journey is versus viewing them as adversaries who are trying to slow us down. So that's been very helpful for us.
Great, thank you. I'll just add real quick. A lot of this sounds to be about creating conversations, evangelizing, educating others that may not have a background in software, may not understand what some of the lingo means, understand what the process and the workflows are, may not understand what can be automated and what can't be automated. So evangelizing sounds like it's a big motivator for getting organizations to change. I do want to mention, I think most people in the room are probably GitHub customers in some way. Don't be shy about engaging GitHub to help with these conversations. We love these conversations. We can help with these demonstrations. We can help show and educate and evangelize on your behalf if you don't want to be the one to evangelize. Because we have seen companies start in a place where, no, we can't work that way. That's just too risky for us. And then move all the way to automating a lot of this.
I think one of the things we did early on, I think like Marco, are you there? Marco, yeah. So we got people from GitHub very early on to come in, and they just were so good. They did so much work to show developers how to use GitHub, how GitHub uses GitHub, how to really streamline, get the system set up, etc. That's very important, but it doesn't stop there. When you get GitHub set up, you then, especially in our case, we realize after a year, people develop different habits. You have to relook at things. You have to be a little bit paranoid. You have to do health checks, keep a lot of data, and see how the whole overall environment is working and the hygiene of it. And I think that's super important. GitHub can be super helpful there. And I think that's one, we went to GitHub 2 weeks ago and just actually asked that, come help us, transition from, we started here, we got to here, and now we want to make it really good for the bigger part of the organization. So I think more of that with GitHub would help, and especially in organizations that, are transitioning.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sid, Natalie, and Thomas, for your time. Hopefully you all found this enjoyable. And we're going to call it a wrap here, but we'll be standing up here for questions if anybody has any. Thank you.